This age of reform, this age of religion reform, is so fascinating for many reasons. One of which is that, perhaps the most important of which, is that as we'll see as I talk about these things, and we talk about them on Thursday, the types of issues that come up and the ways in which different groups in the country address those issues, especially those groups that want reform of one kind or another, are very similar to the issues in the Revolutionary period and the early Republic period. Not necessarily in the sense that they're the same issues, but they're sort of handled in the same way, and there's constant tension between different people with different opinions. But more importantly, at least for what we're going to talk about today, there's a lot of tension within reform groups. So, you know how we talked a lot about in the constitutional period, in the American Revolutionary period, how there's a debate between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and there's a debate between the Republic, the Federalists, and the Jeffersonians, and you know, but it's certainly the case that everybody except those people in Rhode Island wanted independence. It's certainly the case that everybody except Rhode Island wanted a constitution. But there just seems to be constant infighting about how to do it. And that's where these factions come up. And despite the fact that George Washington and even John Adams and a number of the founders believe that there not only shouldn't be political parties, there wouldn't be political parties, because faction was a bad thing. It seems to be one of these human things. So even people who are on the same side, generally speaking, or agree with something in principle, generally speaking, there's usually a wide range of opinion. And you're seeing this now, especially in the American Democratic Party, over all kinds of things, infrastructure, the Biden's various bills, and it goes all the way from Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema on the one side to, if you will, Bernie Sanders and AOC on the other side, and the range of opinions in between. And you know, it's proving very difficult for them to get their act together and to pass something if they want to pass it. Well, that's a lot of these reform movements are somewhat similar in that they all agree on a certain type of reform, like say abolition of slavery or temperance, that is reduction in the amount of drinking or whatever. But they disagree so much over tactics and the extent of the reform, and the timing of the reform. Some abolitionists wanted, you know, slavery abolished immediately. Some people wanted to, you know, kill it through tariffs and taxes on slave goods, and stuff like that. That they're almost fighting with each other as much as they were fighting with the pro-slavery people. So this seems to be a constant strain in American history, but it's also a constant strain in the history of any sort of government, any government, really, where a range of opinions are taken into account. Now, obviously, it's the range of opinions in this case is not the full range of opinions, because women couldn't vote and all kinds of other things, but a lot of opinions are being expressed, even those who can't vote, and so there's bound to be disagreement. But it's the degree to which they can overcome that disagreement that I think determines whether a reform is successful or not. I think we can go back through all the reforms and major reforms in American history and say, well, that eventually got passed, or that eventually got put into law, because the various sub-factions, if you will, were able to agree to at least one thing. The various forms that were able to be put into effect without a civil war. Okay, so what's crucial about this period is that it is a period of much more participatory reform. There are a lot of voluntary associations that have this reform impulse. Now, we talked about in the revolutionary period and other early periods, there are groups, voluntary associations, Sons of Liberty and things like that, who form the famous ones that I always like to talk about, the non-cooperation associations and stuff like that. But it wasn't very common. Well, it's very common in this period. They talk about reform of society, reform of economy, reform of religion, the abolition of slavery, the abolition of the temperance movement, anti-alcohol movement, and on and on and on and on and on. It seems as if, I think your book calls it the reform impulse. It's almost like there's a reform spasm, and lots of people want to change lots of different things right away. There's another sort of reform spasm I don't mean spasm in a negative sense or anything. I just mean that there's a sort of very sharp, immediate reaction to what's going on. So but again, the problem, the thing about this, I shouldn't necessarily say it's a problem, because after all, people are just expressing their opinions, and the different reformers who disagree over tactics are sincere in their beliefs. It isn't just politicking. They adopt a wide variety of tactics to bring about social change. But what I thought I'd do today is talk about what you might consider the more complete ideas of reform, all the way to the more focused ideas of reform. The focused ideas of reform are temperance and slavery. But before that, these more complete ideas are fascinating. And it is one of these periods in which, again, a lot of this stuff started happening. So I want to talk first about utopian communities. And having just been in upstate New York for a long time, I was struck at how many, of course, upstate New York is very beautiful. It's like up to, Appalachian, Pennsylvania, and central and northern Pennsylvania, very pretty to drive through. But also there are historical markers for everything. There's the town of Seneca Falls, obviously. There's all kinds of religious communities and everything as you move through central and western New York. And if you're ever up in that part of the country, we're very lucky in a way to be here in the East, where you can see a lot of the things that you learn about in class. You can actually see the places where they took place. Anyway, so I recommend that highly. And the state of New York, or maybe it's the federal government, or maybe both, have been very good about the historic preservation and things like that. So anyway, the first big comprehensive moves towards reform were in these things called utopian communities. Okay. Historians believe there are about 100 reform communities established in the decades before the Civil War. Okay, and what I mean by reform communities is they were pretty all-encompassing. It wasn't just the abolition of slavery. It wasn't just the temperance movement. It wasn't just the women's suffrage, or just campaigns against child labor and things like that. These communities set out to reorganize society, and by that sense, they meant their society, usually on a cooperative basis, right? They wanted to restore social harmony. They thought that they could see this for this industrial revolution, the effects of it sort of happening, the early industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution. Didn't like it, didn't like what they saw as excessive individualism, didn't like what they saw as a widening gap between the rich and the poor. And so they thought two things. One, these are problems that are going to need to be solved. Three things. One, the problem that need to be solved. Two, they're unchristian, right? These problems are definitely social and moral evils. And three, the only way to solve them is to really, someone needs to come in here. This is Will. Sorry about that, Will. I didn't notice. I had my notes in front of me and not the Zoom screen. So what was I saying? I was saying that the reform must be sort of complete, right? That, we need to have new communities where religion or belief and the way the economy works, the local economy works, and the way society is structured, all that stuff needs to be rethought and repurposed, if you will, and brought about on a more communal basis and on a better basis for the future. Now, I should say there were four things. The other thing about the strength of these movements, and there were movements like this in Europe, particularly in Britain, but also in Germany and France and other places. They were just smaller scale. And they didn't have this one important American aspect. There's a whole lot of rhetoric at this time within these reform movements that says, we are now in this new land, okay? Especially those who are trying to move west, as in Western New York State. Of course, they're not thinking of it being Native American land, but we are now in this new land. Here's our opportunity to create new little societies, new little communities. They can't do it in Europe because they're hemmed in by the churches and by the monarchies and by the old medieval systems of government and all this stuff. Well, out here in Western New York, we don't have that problem. Okay, so we can start this community on our own. This is a sort of an idea like the myth of the Wild West. You go out there on your own and you make your own rules and you build your own stuff. But it is also a sort of a myth. It's a kind of a self-delusion among these groups because they delusion that they believe that they are moral and social pioneers, and that what they are creating is something they will have created all themselves without very much outside influence at all. But they don't realize, because it's happening around them and just seems part of daily life. Sorry, that a lot of the reason they're able to make these new communities and bring about these reforms is because what happens in the market revolution, which we didn't have time to talk about before. It became, places like Western New York became more economically viable. It became less risky and less difficult to go out and found your own community because the Erie Canal was right there. Goods that you could produce on your communal farm. And most of these communal farms really talked about being self-sustaining and not really, well, they didn't ignore the external market, but they could sell on the external market, and new innovations, the McCormick Reaper and stuff like that, made it easier to tinker with the sort of larger questions that had been avoided before, because life itself on a frontier situation there was enough work involved in just feeding yourself. You didn't have time to think about how best to organize society. Now, what I want to talk about first, as I'm trying not to repeat myself from this morning, but the completist or the totalitarian with a small t reform movements, the ones that they thought they could they could solve everything by these new societies. And the first start with religious groups, the Shakers, for instance, very successful in reform. The Shakers are related to the Quakers and the Mennonites and other some other Christian denominations who very much turn the focus of this is not supposed to be happening. My phone is off. Reforming the inner soul and the inner spirit. You reform the inner soul and the inner spirit. You divorce yourself from an outside church structure. You divorce yourself from an established and elaborate established church structure. You can reform yourself with or you have individual spirituality, which will then work with the development of this community that is also attempting to be more spiritual. So, am I recording this, by the way? Crap.
Yeah, it's recording.
Okay, thank God. So the Shakers are sort of the first big one. The Shakers and the Quakers, by the way, get their names from England, where they because they were pejoratively called that because outsiders, particularly Church of England people, saw, or observers, whenever they would see their meetings or whatever, noticed that some Quakers and Shakers would actually literally tremble when they felt imbibed with the Spirit, and so people applied these names as sort of taunt, Shakers and Quakers. Well, eventually the Shakers and Quakers take this on as a sort of badge of honor. Yes, we are so imbued with the Spirit that it actually makes us quake or shake. Anyway, they're founded by a woman named Mother Ann Lee from England. She comes over to the U.S. and helps start the Quaker, the Shaker movement here. Are any of you? A great number of Shakers and Mennonites and other types of denominations have sort of melted away in American culture now, and moved into Methodism and other types of Christian denominations. I know we have in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of Amish communities and similar types of communities. Do any of you come from that kind of background by any chance? I know it's more of a central PA thing, but also in upstate New York, this was a very prominent thing. Anyway, it's extremely interesting. So the first thing is the Shakers believe that men and women are spiritually equal. They also argue that private property should be abandoned and traditional family life should be abandoned. Okay. The one man, one wife, multiple children living in a separate home from other people is not, they felt not the best spiritual way toward. They're much more communal than that. Now, it's not known how communal Shakers were in terms of marital or gender relations, or that's at least not very clear. There are other groups who were more open about that. But one of the things that Shakers developed very early on, and this is one of the things that's, I think, ultimately their downfall, is a strong belief in celibacy. The idea that is that it's one thing to have children, it's another thing to have children, a lot of children, only because you're giving into your carnal desires. They thought that large families of 5, 6, 7, like you saw in Virginia and then Massachusetts for all kinds of reasons, and traditional large families, with people should have been spending that time, for lack of a better phrase, working on their own spirituality. So they encourage celibacy and small families. Some of them encourage celibacy to such a degree that they literally, sorry, I shouldn't say literally, chopped it up. They literally wanted to stop sex. In fact, did stop sex and said, no. We need to be celibate from here on out, and our own salvation will come in that celibacy before we die. Well, one of the problems with this, as you can imagine, is it cuts down on their numbers because, after all, one of the reasons there are families with 7 or 8, 9, 10 children or whatever is not just because mom and dad sit down and say, well, let's, the day after they get married, say, let's have 10 children. It just sort of naturally happens. Well, you've put an artificial limit on that or stop it altogether, it's going to reduce the size of, and if people believe it and buy into it, which they do, that it's going to reduce the size of your community over time. Because the salvation that they think is going to happen, because it partly brought about by celibacy, doesn't happen within their lifetime. So within a few generations, Shakers have to sort of abandon the idea of this kind of celibacy, although they do still value small families over large ones. Now, the reason I'm talking about celibacy at such length is because I want to impress upon you this idea that these Reformed communities firmly believe that they were trying to create a new community in which everything was held within one ideology or one belief system, whatever. So our religion believes one thing, or we base our religion. Our religion is one thing. We base our society on the same thing. We base our economy on the same thing. Everything is going to fit within this one ideal, right? And so the fact that that is successful in gaining adherence early on is very interesting. And one of the reasons that these things, I mean, Shakers and the United Community and things like that, one of the reasons that they gained adherence is because when it comes to moving west, and again, this is still Western England, Western New England, Western New York, what was known as the Western Reserve part of Ohio, northeastern Ohio, but that was considered the West, and on eastern Ohio generally. One of the reasons it was so successful there and here in Western Pennsylvania was because when you go out west and you try to get away from the New England and the East Coast old-fashioned way of doing things, but you want to do things, you want to create a whole new community, you go out west and find this, if you will, virgin land to create a new community. Again, it's not virgin land, it's been taken away from them, the Cherokee removal and things like that. So what was I going on? Oh, the communal aspect of these movements mean they're usually very successful early on in establishing those communities. The Shakers were very economically successful with vegetables and herb cultivation, cattle breeding, furniture making, all kinds of things. When you have to go out there and strike out on your own, so to speak. But the important thing is not striking out on their own individually. They're striking out on their own as a very, very large group. Okay, so it's quite easy then to go out in the middle of, lack of a better way of phrasing, like in the middle of nowhere, and start off by saying, "Okay, John, your job is to draw the water, and in the Mary, you're going to be the teacher," and so on. So it's almost an immediate community is right there. So it makes starting off easier and early success very likely. It's much easier to do that than just individual families going out having to do everything from scratch themselves. Now, another one of these groups, because of comprehensive groups, was the Oneida group in New York. Now, the founder of this was a man named John Noyes, Noyes, and he preached that he and his followers had become so perfect that they'd achieve a state of complete purity of heart, or a level of complete sinfulness. Sinlessness, right? Started in Vermont. Okay, they abandoned private property. They abandoned this traditional family life. They work in they have what are called complex marriages. Okay, and this gets them into trouble in Vermont. The authorities don't like these things that look like what do you call it? Polygamy. Okay. And so they feel oppressed in New York. They feel a lot of charges of adultery are brought against them. So they up sticks and moved out to Oneida, New York. Okay? And they build this new community. It's still there. Well, the Oneida, New York is still there. The community that they built is not still there. What happened with this, and this is one of the things that happens with these comprehensive communities, is it became increasingly dictatorial. Okay, so you had to do everything according to the ideology of John Noyes, and you have to, everyone had to fit into a certain pattern, a certain rhythm, a certain way of doing things. There was very little opportunity for free expression, or no opportunity for free expression. Your role was determined for you. We were supposed to work. There was sharing of goods. There was no building of private wealth and all that, individual wealth and all that kind of stuff. So it became a dictatorial environment. It became a totalitarian environment. They even went so far as to start dealing in something called eugenics, which you may or may not know about. Eugenics was a pseudoscience, and by the way, was debated and discussed and believed by lots of people well into the 20th century. And the idea was that only the fittest should breed and should reproduce. And later on, this is pre-Darwinian, the Oneida people are talking about. Later on, when Darwin comes out with his Origin of Species, and more importantly, when Charles Spencer defines that idea as the survival of the fittest, eugenics really sort of takes off as this very attractive idea. As you improve society by either not letting inferior people breed, or by outbreeding inferior people. And you can imagine that this is, well, first of all, everyone nowadays recognizes this is biologically incorrect, but also morally outrageous. And of course, it's taken to its furthest extreme with the Nazis. But anyway, so the Oneida people do this, and like the Nazis anyway. What starts when I better talk about one more strain of this, and then I'll get onto the totalitarianness. So the Shakers and the United community are very good representations of these reform communities that were based on religion initially. But there are other reform communities that weren't necessarily based on religion, or weren't primarily based on religion, or worked on a sort of secular religions. I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but that's kind of what I mean. And these were called worldly communities. Okay. In New England, for instance, there was a community that didn't put as its primary focus the spiritual regeneration of its members. There's a worldly community in New England. They established something called Brook Farm, and they believed that, for instance, manual labor and intellectual labor could coexist harmoniously. They borrowed a lot of ideas from early French reformers, early French small s socialists. This is before Marx and Engels and all that. So Charles Fourier and people like that, and the idea was that all work is equal, or all work has equal value, and therefore everyone should do it, right? So that if you build a new community, if you build Brook Farm, not only should the people who do manual labor traditionally do manual labor, but so should the people who do who are the teachers, for instance, or for lack of a better word, because there weren't accountants really in those days, or bookkeepers. A bookkeeper should also spend his time doing manual labor. Okay. Now there are all kinds of communities where this happens. This happens. I mean, I was joking this morning that I don't know if you know the grocery store Trader Joe's. They're scattered around, but the idea, and one of the ideas in Trader Joe's, is that all employees are trained to be able to do anything. So the bookkeeper in the back can, if called upon, run to and bag groceries in the front, or stock shelves if something's needed. Everyone is very interchangeable. You might specialize in one thing, but you also did this other thing. Well, that's the way Brook Farm was. And it works again. It's one of these things that starts off really well and works really well, but it becomes too totalitarian. It says, you know, John, you have to go out and till the fields. Mary, you school teacher, you have to go out and till the fields. And this might seem intriguing and interesting and egalitarian and everything to intellectuals or what we now call white collar people, but and they might seem, a lot of 20th century people see this, 19th century, 20th century see these people as an ideal. This is an ideal. Everybody works together and there's no snobbery. Well, that's fine until you actually have to start to do it. And an awful lot of people who are educated or whatever they find out, they might like farming for a couple of months or a season or something, or see value in it, but pretty soon people start to get disheartened with it. Okay, so it was very hard, nigh on impossible, to break down the old established ways of dividing labor by ability, right? And to impose that from the top down was another sort of thing that irritated. It eventually began to irritated people, and Brook Farm falls apart. The second group of worldly communities that's so important is something called the Owenites. There's a man named Robert Owen, and he was a factory manager in Scotland in a place called New Lanark, and he developed a sort of company town in a good way. He developed good working conditions, developed schools for children, developed daycare centers, all kinds of stuff that the factory could make sure they had good workers, because the workers were treated well and the workers were part of the community and had a say in what happened in the community and all things like that. Okay, they were paid well. They shared in all the labor and all the profits of the textile mills in New Lanark. But the thing was, eventually the Owen and the Owenites feel hemmed in by Scottish and to a certain extent British generally tradition, and they don't feel that they can. They want to grow, and they don't feel they can grow because no one else sort of believes in their way of doing these things. So they up sticks. And I can't remember how it works. I'm surprised that I don't remember how it works. I did my senior thesis on Robert Owen. They're offered the chance to, Owen himself was offered the chance to get this plot of land in Indiana, a big plot of land on a river, and jumps at it because it could, again, this whole thing of starting from scratch in the American Virgin Territory, very powerful motivating force. Well, anyway, so he jumps at it, and they go off and they found this place called New Harmony in Indiana. And New Harmony, like Oneida, is still around, and you can go, if you're going to Chicago or something like that, drop by you shouldn't be going. If you're going to St. Louis, you'd be going to New Harmony, which was really Robert Owen didn't last very long, but his kids and descendants kept it going. I'm going to put a link for this in the chat if ever you're driving that way. It's interesting to see.
I think you muted.
Where did I? Okay, well, let me just say, I'll go back to just talking about New Harmony. If you're driving to St. Louis, stop by New Harmony, Indiana. There's an interesting sort of museum there that it shows all the things. It shows how what's called the Harmonist settlements used to be comprised of. So anyway, the whole thing was that these Owenite communities were called secular communitarian communities. They believe in secular communitarianism. The idea is that, first of all, secular, we extract this religion thing from it because Robert Owen especially thought, because there had been these religious reform communities in England, and they almost all fell apart because they were so dictatorial on the theological level. Well, Owen says if you eliminate that, we can actually build a communitarian community. So the community is the whole thing. Workers receive full value of their labor. Women have equal rights in men. Women have equal education than men, and all this stuff. And it started in New Harmony anyway. It starts as again very, very successfully, very, very prosperous because of this sort of, it's easier to build stuff when you have a whole group out that goes and settles. But again, it just, one of the reasons some of the Owenites leave the Owenite communities in Scotland is the same reason that people in New Harmony leave the Owenite communities in New Harmony in Indiana, because the idea is that you're being pressed down, you're being told what to do all the time by these bigwigs, right? They've decided what the ideology of the group is going to be, and therefore we're all going to follow that group. Okay, and so New Harmony eventually, at least in terms of a communitarian group that follows these rules and follows these traditions and patterns of social activity. I think it lasts maybe 5 years, maybe longer than that. And people don't necessarily fritter away geographically, because again, this is right on the Ohio. It's at the confluence of the Ohio and the, down where Indiana and Kentucky and Illinois meet. Then you go down a little bit, St. Louis. It's all there. So it's a very prosperous kind of area. So New Harmony keeps going, but the Owenite aspect of it doesn't, because too many people flee. And the problem with this, and with all these utopian communities, is that there isn't any. They don't know when to stop. The religious ones are too controlling. The secular ones are too controlling. People get tired of being told, no, your job is you're going to do this, and you have to do it this way, and you have to believe in the way we do things. Okay, this sort of, it starts off as a good idea, but then it gets too oppressive. And it's not too much of a stretch to say that the worst examples of this sort of way of living. Now, the Owenites aren't like this. The Oneida people aren't like this, but eventually, when you take this to extremes, you have Stalinist Russia or Maoist China, right? Where you have a really, really severe totalitarian system that says we're in control of the whole society, economy, society, education, everything, and it's all going to work this way, and everyone is a little cog. Well, that doesn't last long. In fact, I hadn't thought of this morning, but it's not a bad parallel either, because these utopian communities only last 10, 15 years at the most. And communist countries in the modern world really only last at the most 40 years. They aren't things that last very long, because there's this eventual crackdown. The delusion starts pretty soon, and then even with all the apparatus of the modern state, police forces, intelligence forces, military forces, whatever, it's still impossible to keep individualism down for for that long. So they lasted longer in the 20th century than they did in the 19th century, but they still didn't last all that long. Okay. Now the thing about, by the way, I'm certainly still on off view. One of the things that helps all of this move along is that, so anyway, all these utopian communities sort of fail for the most part. But the sort of kernel of inspiration that started them was something called the second great. Well, it worked. The kernel of inspiration that started them, the idea that humans could improve themselves, improve their communities through their own labor, right, is boosted up by something called the second Great Awakening. This is a religious revivalism of this period. It's a long period, and it's a period of a large outdoor preaching meetings, itinerant preachers going around and spreading the word. Itinerant meaning that they're literally the circuit preachers. They're given a circuit to ride around a certain area of the country and preach, and constantly pushing the idea that that enlightenment and that reform and that improvement can come from within. You don't need the church, an established church. You don't need the Archbishop of Canterbury or the sorry, hang on one second. You don't need the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope or even the Congregationalist minister in your New England town to tell you what to do, to tell you how to survive salvation. Salvation can be found just through faith alone, but also through your own individual movement towards becoming saved. Okay, remember, up until this time, there had been, you'd had on the one hand established churches, Catholicism. I'm talking about Europe now. Catholicism, Church of England, state churches in Germany, state churches in France. But you also had other sects within Protestantism, like Calvinism, who believed in predestination. Either you were predestined to be saved, or you weren't. You could continue to be. You could be a Calvinist and start to discover whether you had been predestined, but it takes so long that you eventually die of old age first. So in the first Great Awakening and the second Great Awakening in America, anyway, were the really first movements that said that worked with Americans that said, no, this can be done individually. This can be a journey of self-discovery. Anyway, and this becomes very, very attractive to people, right? It's exactly what everybody wants to hear, that you have your own agency, you have your own power to do this. And so a lot of these a lot of the original religious communities don't so much religious utopian communities, which are failing, they latch on to Great Awakening thinking, if you will, and move it even in a more religious direction, but sort of leave the totalitarian aspect alone of their societies alone. So that's why you have Shakers becoming Mennonites and Mennonites becoming Methodists, or and things like that, because there's a sort of moving away from the stricter constructions of how you're supposed to behave morally. Okay, and so what happens is the reform movements start to believe that, okay, we can't. Now, don't get me wrong, people don't sit down. There isn't a constitutional convention where they sit down to decide these things. They are hashed out among sort of leaders and theological leaders at the time, and they work on their on how this should be reformed. as much as they can. The idea is that, well, the totalitarian, they didn't use that word, by the way. The totalitarianism doesn't work. Okay. But we can work on specific reforms of specific problems, right? That can be solved and be achieved. And I just want to talk about two of them right now because they're the most important of this period, and ultimately they're the most successful. The first one is the temperance movement. Okay, so you have a lot of temperance people. Temperance is, of course, the reduction in the amount of consumption of alcohol, or sometimes, quite frankly, the convincing people to become totally abstinent. Okay, it became sort of a badge of respectability to become a temperance reformer, particularly in urban areas and small town areas. You saw the effects that alcohol and alcoholism, the bad effects of alcohol, and obviously all bad effects of alcoholism, had on society. You had people missing work. You had people drinking themselves to death. You had people drinking themselves into enfeeblement. They couldn't work very well. You had spousal abuse in the home. You had child abuse in the home. You had fighting and rioting, not rioting, but bar brawls and I shouldn't say bars because they weren't bars back then, but the tavern brawls and things like that. So it looks like this one thing, booze, has to be fixed. Booze is causing all these other problems, and we're not going to mess with people's lives in total, but we are going to say if you give up the booze, it'll solve all these other problems. And again, like a lot of things, these things are initially very, very successful. Temperance people are able to point to specific, in every little community, specific groups, say, look, Mary gave up the booze and now she's a better mother, and now she's doing this, and now she's doing that. She works in the church. John gave up the booze. Now he holds down a job successfully, and on and on and on and on and on. So temperance has initially many successes at the local level, but then it starts to broaden out. And the whole idea is that temperance societies eventually want to ban alcohol completely from the country. Now they're able to do that by the early 20th century, but we'll get to that later. Well, sorry, we don't get to get to that in this class. You have to take next semester's class to get to. They also engender a great deal of hostility. Okay, temperance campaigners, well, Catholics especially urban Catholics, Irish Catholics, German Catholic immigrants, really resented temperance campaigners, not only because they were anti-booze, because after all, in Catholicism and some other religions, alcohol actually plays a role, sacramental wine and things like that. And also alcohol was often the use of alcohol was justified in some communities by, this is what brings us together. This is what makes our community knit together better. Now, obviously the abuse of alcohol is something that's a bad thing, but alcohol in itself, if used properly, can be a good thing. Well, the temperance movement goes so far as to start seeing this sort of rhetoric of, well, the dirty Irish drunkard, or the dirty German drunkard. These towns like Milwaukee and St. Louis that start to spring up and start to become, later in the 19th century, big brewing capitals. This becomes, those are very German towns. And the idea is, oh, Lordy, here we have this ethnic group coming in, bringing their obsession with beer with them. And therefore, the whole place is going to hell. So the temperance movements latch on to ethnic discrimination as well as the hatred of booze itself. And this causes severe backlash. And it's never possible, though there are some dry counties at various parts of the United States in this period, it isn't possible for temperance campaigners to succeed completely and ban booze until prohibition, right? But that's the reason I talk so much about this is it's interesting how these reform movements often usually start off very well. Either whether they're highly focused like temperance or they're universal like the United Community, they start off very well, but then they start pushing it too far, and everything eventually starts to fall apart. And there's enough reaction against their preaching and moralizing and their pressure in churches and in government that there's a backlash. This is one of the reasons why you have, for instance, the rise of Tammany Hall politics in New York is partly to protect the drink trade. It's one of the reasons why you have a big brewing interest in Chicago become so politically powerful. It's to protect the drink trade. So the only thing that sort of remains out of this period of religion and reform is the religion part. America becomes extremely diverse in terms of Christian religions and denominations. There are splinter groups. There are hundreds of them, and lots of people argue very much that that's one of the strengths of the movement. And the fact that at least there is no Protestant on Protestant violence, strictly Protestant on Protestant violence, is quite an interesting thing in American history. Now, there's plenty of violence on African American Protestants, but that is because of race. If you see what I mean, there aren't people going to the mattresses over who's a Mennonite versus who's a Shaker. Okay, there's racial hatred and all that sort of stuff, and there might be religious denominational hatred. It certainly is against Catholics, but there isn't necessarily warfare within the Protestant community. Now I should say that's a very, very narrow definition of thing, because there are anti-Catholic riots and things like that. So it's not just within Christianity; it's within Protestantism that you have this sort of acceptance of diversity. Now, the second thing I want to talk about in terms of the focused reform groups is the anti-slavery movement. Okay, now this starts off very early on. There are problems with slavery in the founding period. Founders. Sorry, I kind of stopped saying founding fathers. People haven't been saying that for 20 years. The founders are distressed about slavery. They don't like it. They live with it. Many of them individually. Thomas Jefferson is very hypocritical about it. Thinks about its eventual decline and disappearance on an intellectual level, but then goes and abuses his slaves on a personal, individual level. But wrestling what to do about slavery becomes an issue after the slave trade is closed and after in the early 19th century. So there are all kinds of ideas put forward by these reform groups. There's something called the American Colonization Society, founded in 1816, which the idea was we're going to resettle Black Americans to Africa. Okay, and this is very popular. In fact, they do end up. They found Liberia. The country of Liberia was founded by the ACS in order to give African Americans a home back in Africa if they wanted one. And there were a lot of African American free blacks in the North, especially who promoted these sorts of things. Okay, but of course, one of the problems with this is that these people had lived in the North American continent for generations. They had almost no, except for genetic, I suppose, almost no connection with Africa. It's very rare that, as far as we can tell, it's very hard to tell, but as far as historians can tell, it's very rare that African customs and traditions survived the process of them being beaten out of them by slave owners, right? So most most slaves in the United States, especially by the 1820s, were as American as anybody else. That's not really the way I wanted to phrase it, but it's not like they could point to them and say, I'm Ghanaian, or I'm from this part of West Africa. They just literally don't know because it was beaten out of them, and they were by this time they're also starting to become Christianized. But anyway, the abolition movements become very, very strong in this period, all the way up into the Civil War, up to including the Civil War. There were militant abolitionists, people who encouraged slaves to rise up, and encouraged white people to help them rise up and help them fight back against their masters. The biggest sort of movement, the biggest sort of organization to appear really started by a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who started a newspaper in 1831 called The Liberator, and who called for immediate abolition and immediate redistribution of land and things like that, and became extremely popular. The Liberator became the most important abolitionist news / opinion organ in the country. The Liberty Bell, what we know as the Liberty Bell today, was actually named the Liberty Bell because of the Liberator magazine. In 1835, it was rung because of I can't remember what the specific anniversary was being celebrated, but the Liberty Bell referred to abolitionism, not to the liberty of the founding generation of white people trying to get liberty from Britain. Now, here's one of the reasons why the abolition movement has to become so strong in this period, and that is because with the invention of the cotton gin in the late 18th century, and the invention of certain different type of building techniques which allowed towns to really grow in concentrated areas and people to have a sort of sophisticated urban life based on the profits of their farming, is that cotton just explodes in terms of production and in terms of value, and slavery suddenly becomes much, much more important than it had been even in the tobacco and sugar days. Right? And so there's a shift in Southern opinion, especially towards the idea that, first of all, there's the idea way back when that slavery is a necessary evil. It's a thing we live with. We struggle with it morally and intellectually, but it's the way the world is. And, we hope that it'll solve itself someday. Well, that opinion, that ideology dies out and was gradually replaced by the ideology that slavery is a positive good. Okay? God created the world, He created all the races within the world. He put them in hierarchical order. It's obvious He put them in hierarchical order, they argue, because look, this is the way things are. Okay, and so it's the right thing to do. Slavery is the right thing. It's the right position for Africa, for blacks to have in American society, and that slavery had made certain countries, certain places great. Slavery had made Rome into a great empire. Egyptian slavery had made Egypt into a dominant empire of its time. It's slavery that's producing all these cotton that's creating the whole wealth in the North, and it's creating American trade throughout the world. Okay, so the growth of the belief in slavery as a positive good was just enormous in this period, and abolitionists feel they have to fight back against that. Okay, and they do have to fight back against it because, we tend to think of this as a North-South thing, but if all of a sudden the textile factory in Cohoes, New York, built in 1830, has to start creating, weaving, it's called, what do they call it? Spinning or weaving the cloth, however they make it, out of cotton produced by free labor, it's going to become much, much more expensive, okay, and much, much more difficult to compete on the open market, right? Egyptian cotton was, because of the cotton gin, Egyptian cotton was starting to compete with American cotton. Slavery was supported, at least in theory, by a lot more people than just Southern slave owners. So what I'm trying to say is there's an intensification, an ideological intensification on both sides, an ideological intensification of the belief in slavery as a positive good thing and a way forward, and then the intensification of the feeling that no, that makes it even more evil. We're profiteering off of something that was evil to begin with. It's not like just adding sin upon sin upon sin, and that's why eventually you have such fierce abolitionists in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, and the run up to the Civil War. Okay, I will leave it there because I want to talk about other things in the recorded lecture, the one with all the pictures, like the women's suffrage movement and other reform movements. But before we go, I want to ask for questions. Yes, no questions at all. Okay, look for your paper grades online tonight. They'll be there, and I will talk to you on Thursday. Your discussion agenda assignments are all up there on Canvas, so we're ready to go for Thursday. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Adios.
Have a good one.
Okay, you too.